The sacred city of Thebes wasn't merely built, it was carved from the very bedrock of eternity, designed to outlast time itself. In 663 BC, this city, known to its people as Waset, was far more than a capital. It was the living, breathing heart of religion and absolute power. Imagine the sheer, staggering scale of it. Colossal pylons of the Karnak temple reaching up, tearing into the cloudless African sky. The walls were not the faded stone we see today. They were vibrant, covered in fresh layers of rich ochre, lapis lazuli, and deep malachite. High above the bustling streets, the tips of giant obelisks were capped with electrum, a brilliant alloy of gold and silver. They reflected the punishing African sun with such an intense, blinding radiance that it physically hurt the eyes to look upon them. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with the intoxicating scent of burning myrrh, the sweetness of blue lotus and roasting meats. These constant offerings were dedicated to the great god Amun, an endless cycle of sacrifice to maintain the delicate balance of the universe. Down on the streets, life boiled over. Egyptian society of this era was a highly complex, layered, and multifaceted world. The elite classes strolled through the heat wearing the finest, almost completely transparent white linen, gathered into incredibly complex, elegant folds. Both men and women adorned themselves with massive, heavy wigs crafted from natural hair, symbolizing their high status and wealth. These wigs were generously coated with thick aromatic oils and animal fats that would slowly melt under the relentless sun. As the perfumed oils melted, they cascaded down their necks and shoulders, providing a cooling sensation against the unforgiving desert heat. Their eyes were heavily lined with thick black kohl. It wasn't merely a tribute to beauty, but a necessary shield against the glare and infections. Resting heavily on their collarbones were massive Usik necklaces, intricately woven from pure gold and brightly colored faience beads. But the true power in this city did not belong to the native Egyptians from the Delta. A new force had risen from the deep south, the kingdom of Kush. These Nubian kings saw themselves not as conquerors, but as the true righteous guardians of ancient Egyptian tradition. The Black Pharaohs of the 25th dynasty had launched a holy war to rescue Egypt, sparking a massive cultural and architectural renaissance. Pharaoh Tantamani, ruler of a staggering empire stretching from modern Khartoum to the Mediterranean Sea, sat securely upon the throne in Thebes. The streets were patrolled by his elite Nubian guard. They were striking figures, wearing leopard skins draped carelessly over their white linen. Heavy gold rings hung from their ears, catching the light. In their hands they carried magnificent bronze kopashes, deadly sickle-shaped swords. Bronze wasn't merely a metal used for war. It was the ultimate symbol of divine order, Maat. It was beautiful, ductile, and believed to be invincible. Egypt lived in an unshakable certainty that this ancient order could never be broken. The return to tradition provided a deeply comforting, false sense of security. The temple vaults were once again filled with unimaginable wealth. The massive state granaries were bursting with harvested grain. The Nile River faithfully flooded its banks exactly on time, delivering the dark, fertile silt that gave life to the entire civilization. To them, the world was perfectly understood and neatly structured. The high priests of Ammon dictated the will of the gods from their inner sanctums, and the pharaoh ensured eternal harmony between the heavens and the earth. But this belief was a fragile bubble ready to burst. Beyond the familiar sands of the Sinai Peninsula, where the deserts gave way to the harsh mountains and plains of Mesopotamia, order meant nothing. The outside world had mutated into something unrecognizable. The Romantic era, where wars were settled with beautiful bronze blades, was over. The world was entering a dark, freezing, and merciless industrial age of death. And this new world was already marching toward the borders of Egypt. No one in the ancient world could have possibly been prepared for the sheer devastation brought by the advancing army of Ashurbanipal. While the Egyptian army fiercely defended a sacred, ancient order, the Neo-Assyrian war machine was history's very first true army of professionals. They were an industrial conveyor belt specifically designed for the absolute destruction of rival states. This was a calculated, technological execution. To the Egyptians, the advancing Assyrian soldiers looked exactly like a terrifying living nightmare brought forth from the underworld. Instead of light linen, the Assyrian infantry was encased in heavy interlocking scale armor that draped heavily all the way down to their knees. Upon their heads gleamed tall, conical helmets, and their thick, carefully curled beards sharply contrasted with the clean-shaven Egyptian elite. But the most terrifying aspect of this invading force was not their brutal appearance or their heavy armor. It was their weapons, iron. The complex technology behind smelting iron was guarded as the strictest of state secrets, requiring temperatures far beyond traditional Egyptian kilns. When a beautifully crafted bronze Egyptian khopesh violently struck an Assyrian iron sword, the bronze simply bent, blunted, or shattered completely. The cold Assyrian iron knew absolutely no mercy, systematically slicing through hardened leather shields and piercing softer bronze breastplates with horrifying ease. Ashurbanipal's relentless march down the Nile River wasn't just a military campaign. It was the methodical, systematic erasure of all hope. The Assyrians brought highly calculated tactics of terror. They didn't just defeat their enemies, they completely eradicated the very thought of resistance. Prisoners were subjected to horrific, unimaginable fates, serving as a grim, gruesome warning to any city that dared to keep its gates closed. The terrifying news of their extreme brutality always outpaced their marching army, effectively paralyzing the enemy's will to fight before they even arrived. And then the inevitable happened. A massive, choking cloud of dust finally began to rise on the horizon just outside the gates of Thebes. The terrifying, rhythmic sound of the marching iron infantry echoed heavily across the valley, resembling the low rumble of an impending earthquake. Thousands of heavy leather boots, meticulously reinforced with thick metal plates, brutally trampled the sacred, ancient sands of Egypt into the mud. The massive Assyrian war chariots rolling into the valley were significantly larger, much heavier, and far more stable than the older Egyptian designs. Pulled by 4 massive Mesopotamian horses, these formidable machines carried a full specialized crew, a highly skilled driver, an archer, and a shield-bearer. Pharaoh Tantamani, fully realizing the apocalyptic scale of the disaster, desperately threw his combined Nubian and Egyptian regiments directly into the Iron Storm. The resulting battle on the direct approaches to the sacred city wasn't just incredibly bloody, it was a completely deafening clash of worlds. The deafening ring of shattering metal and cracking wood blended with the screams of men and horses into an absolute cacophony of the apocalypse. Nubian archers, famous across the ancient world, unleashed a massive hail of arrows, but they bounced harmlessly off the impenetrable Assyrian scale armor. When the massive armies finally clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat, the stark technological gap immediately proved absolutely fatal for the defenders. The elegant sacred bronze of the Nile Valley choked in its own blood beneath the relentless, heavy strikes of Mesopotamian iron. The proud lines of the Egyptian defense violently shuddered and broke. The finest warriors of the Kushite kings fell helplessly against the steel wall. Witnessing his elite army completely decimated, Pharaoh Tantamani made the agonizing choice to flee deep into the south to save his dynasty. He left the greatest city in the known world completely defenseless. The Kushites were violently pushed back, leaving the Egyptian heartland in absolute ruins. The sacred city of Thebes, the majestic home of the gods, held its breath in a dead, suffocating silence, broken only by the approaching metallic clatter. The blood-soaked Assyrian army finally marched up to the unguarded gates. The age of bronze had fallen. Iron had come to violently claim its reward. In the year 663 BC, an event unfolded that the Egyptian people considered to be absolutely, fundamentally impossible. The Assyrians breached the sacred city of Thebes. This was far more than a simple military defeat. It was the total collapse of their entire concept of the universe and cosmic order. The city, which for millennia had been considered the untouchable center of the world and the home of the sun god, was now completely defenseless. The streets of Thebes, once filled with the gentle chants of priests and the sweet aroma of incense, now echoed with screams and metallic clashing. To the native Egyptians, these Assyrian soldiers, with their dark beards and heavy iron armor, looked exactly like demons emerging from the underworld. They moved methodically, house by house, temple by temple, completely devastating the capital with the cold, ruthless efficiency of an industrial machine. Imagine the Karnak temple, the absolute greatest religious structure of the ancient world, completely overrun by this iron tide of destruction. The towering forest of giant columns supported magnificent painted ceilings depicting the starry night sky, now obscured by the thick smoke of burning offerings. High-ranking priests, dressed in their flawless white linen and sacred leopard skins, desperately tried to block the entrances to the inner sanctuaries. Their shaved heads gleamed with sweat and absolute terror as they faced a mechanical enemy that possessed no respect for their ancient holy traditions. But for the Iron Legion of Ashurbanipal, there was no such thing as sacred ground. Their only objective was the absolute extraction of wealth. Heavy iron axes and swords easily hacked through the massive temple doors made of Lebanese cedar, which were beautifully inlaid with copper and gold. The subsequent looting took on a horrifying industrial scale. The Assyrians weren't just destroying the city, they were systematically draining its lifeblood. They forcefully stripped the thick gold leaf directly off the sacred statues of the gods, erasing the divine faces that had watched over Egypt for centuries. The precious electrum, the brilliant alloy that had famously shone on the very peaks of the giant granite obelisks, was mercilessly hacked away. Golden scepters, ritual vessels, heavy necklaces heavy with lapis lazuli and carnelian, golden burial masks, and thousands of sacred amulets were gathered. All of these priceless artifacts were unceremoniously dumped into massive glittering piles right in the middle of the blood-stained temple courtyards. The civilian population of Thebes, who had grown entirely accustomed to centuries of absolute security and abundance, now found themselves plunged into a living hell. Master artisans who had spent their lives crafting the finest jewelry, and elite scribes whose only weapon had been a reed brush, were rounded up like cattle. Noble women in their torn, semi-transparent Calasiris dresses, their eyes still heavily lined with malachite and coal, were suddenly stripped of all dignity. They were mercilessly herded through their own ruined streets, bound tightly together by thick ropes tied directly around their necks. The absolute elite of the ancient world were instantly transformed into disenfranchised slaves, destined to build the grand palaces of distant Nineveh. For a devout Egyptian, the most horrifying aspect wasn't the physical violence, but the utter destruction of Maat, the fundamental harmony of the universe. Watching violent foreigners, ignorant of the ancient rituals, lay their dirty hands upon the sacred barks of the gods was a fate worse than death. To see the altars defiled and the eternal statues of their ancestors smashed to pieces meant the absolute destruction of their eternal afterlife. It was the equivalent of the death of the soul. A spiritual apocalypse playing out in real time under the punishing glare of the sun. The sun continued to beat down on the Nile Valley, just as it had for thousands of years, indifferent to the suffering below. But for the traumatized inhabitants of Thebes, their beautiful, structured world had been entirely swallowed by an absolute, impenetrable darkness. The glorious, seemingly eternal golden age of the pharaohs had violently and definitively ended, crushed under the overwhelming weight of progress. It was brutally trampled into the dust by the heavy, marching boots of a ruthless, expanding iron empire that cared nothing for the past. As the thick, choking smoke from the relentless fires finally began to clear over the Nile, a truly terrifying new reality was revealed to the world. The once magnificent Waset, the legendary city of 100 gates, now lay completely broken, its grandeur reduced to smoldering, dusty ruins. The Assyrian army was already heavily burdened with unimaginable amounts of looted wealth, preparing for the long, arduous march back to Mesopotamia. But simple gold and slaves were not enough. To permanently humiliate Egypt, they orchestrated an unprecedented, monumental act of cultural vandalism. As their ultimate trophy, the invaders decided to steal the sacred Egyptian obelisks, the towering monuments dedicated to the mighty sun god. These were not mere statues. They were gigantic, solid monoliths of pure Aswan granite, weighing hundreds of tons, deeply rooted in the earth. Now, using a complex system of thick ropes and wooden rollers, thousands of weeping captives were forced to drag their own heritage away. The brutal crack of whips mixed with the groaning of timber as the massive stone pillars were slowly pulled through the blood-stained dust. Inch by agonizing inch, the sacred monuments were dragged away from the life-giving shores of the Nile toward the harsh, distant eastern plains. In this single devastating campaign, The geopolitical map of the entire ancient world had been violently and permanently redrawn. The proud Kushite kings, the dark-skinned pharaohs, who had desperately tried to restore Egypt's ancient glory, were utterly broken and defeated. They were violently pushed far back into the deep south, retreating to their ancestral lands, never again to sit upon the throne of Thebes. The heartland of the pharaohs was left hollowed out, its temples plundered, and its once mighty society forced to its knees. In place of divine rulers, the Assyrians installed obedient foreign puppet kings, whose only real purpose was to continuously funnel tribute eastward. For the surviving Egyptians, it was a moment of horrifying clarity. The era of absolute, untouchable Egyptian autonomy was gone forever. The nation was no longer an isolated, sacred oasis perfectly protected by vast, impassable deserts on all sides. The endless sea of sand that had acted as a shield for millennia had now transformed into a wide-open highway for hungry, advanced empires. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the definitive proof that iron had completely triumphed over bronze in every conceivable way. Cold, calculated pragmatism, immense cruelty, and an industrial approach to warfare had absolutely obliterated the old, ritualistic ways of battle. The elegant, incredibly beautiful, but hopelessly outdated system of Egyptian warfare was buried under the heavy tread of iron boots. Egypt was now forcibly dragged into its late period, a sunset era of decline where sheer strength would no longer guarantee survival. From now on, the existence of the nation would rely on the dangerous, incredibly delicate art of diplomacy and political maneuvering. To survive, they would be forced to adapt, hiring heavily armed Greek mercenaries to fight their battles and protect their borders. They would have to navigate complex alliances, constantly paying heavy tributes to rising empires just to maintain the mere illusion of their ancient culture. The catastrophic sack of Thebes in 663 BC stands as a massive, bleeding watershed moment in the deep history of human civilization. It marked the violent end of glorious isolation. The world was rapidly becoming a much tighter, harsher, and far more unforgiving place. The breathtaking beauty of polished bronze, the finest sheer linen, and the most complex theological systems were utterly powerless. All the prayers to Amun meant absolutely nothing when faced with the raw, cold, and inescapable power of forged Mesopotamian iron. The great city of Thebes would physically survive, and parts would eventually be rebuilt, but its soul had been permanently shattered. The unshakable belief in its own eternity was dragged away to the east, as the sun finally set on the gods, and the dark Iron Age of humanity began.